Hello and welcome to my third video on book lessons and thoughts. Today we're going to be looking at a book written by Matthew Walker called Why We Sleep. This has been a very interesting book for me, and I think it's had an impact on the way I perceive sleep. This video is meant to share the important points that I learned from this book. However, it is not meant to be extensive or conclusive, and I do recommend that you read the book yourself to have a good understanding of the topic. This book talks about the processes of sleep, the health benefits and advantages of sleep, and the importance of each stage of sleep. It also talks about sleep disorders and the consequences of bad sleep and the absence of sleep. I hope you enjoy the video. If you have any questions, please comment below and I'll be happy to read them. All living species have an internal clock known as the circadian rhythm, and this dictates our sleep and wakeful cycles. Now, the human circadian rhythm is about 24 hours and 15 minutes, so it's actually a bit longer than the day that we consider a 24-hour period. Our sleep and wake cycles are controlled by the suprachiasmatic nucleus in the brain, and there are two important key factors that affect the activity of the suprachiasmatic nucleus. This includes light and also our core body temperature, and we'll go on to talk about these two factors. So as I was mentioning, we all have our internal clocks. However, what happens when we go abroad and travel abroad to different time zones? So this is what results in something called jet lag. So what happens is that we're used to certain daylight hours at certain times. However, when we go abroad and the daylight hours changes, this can affect our suprachiasmatic nucleus and affect the time we get to sleep. Now, our internal clocks, our circadian rhythms, can adjust about 1 hour per day, and that's why when you go abroad, you will experience a jet lag on the first few days. We've all heard the terms night owl and morning lark. Night owl to describe the individual who is up late at night working or relaxing, and morning lark to describe the individual who wakes up very early compared to the general population. Now, these terms are based on biological and genetic blueprints. The author describes that there is an evolutionary advantage to have some of the population or some of the tribe initially to wake up earlier than others to protect the vulnerable sleeping, and similarly those who go to sleep early to be protected by those night owls who stay up. However, in today's society, night owls suffer due to the early starts. They are more at risk of physical conditions such as cancer, stroke, also mental health conditions such as anxiety and depression. There are three key hormones that are released in the brain and that have an effect on the suprachiasmatic nucleus. This includes melatonin, adenosine, and orexin. Melatonin is released from the pineal gland, and it acts on the suprachiasmatic nucleus to trigger the generation of sleep. And the level of melatonin slowly increases from around 6 or 7 p.m. throughout the evening to help stimulate that sleep. Now, the other hormone is adenosine. Adenosine starts to rise from when you wake up in the morning around 7 a.m. and it acts as a pressure for you to sleep. But both of these hormones act on the suprachiasmatic nucleus. Now, I'll go on to talk about orexin later on in the video when I mention a certain disease. There are two key features in sleep. One, and firstly, is the loss of awareness of our environment. When we sleep, we are not aware of any smells, of sounds, of visual images when we sleep. And this is because our thalamus sensory gate becomes closed off. And it's a key feature that we'll talk about in this video. The second key feature is a loss of awareness of time. Time becomes distorted when we're sleeping. We find it difficult to know how much time has passed. So there are two stages of sleep that are commonly referred by scientists when talking about sleep. This includes NREM and REM. So what do these words stand for? So NREM stands for non-rapid eye movement. REM stands for rapid eye movement. Now these are long words, but it's quite simple, that when scientists observed people sleeping, they noticed that on one stage people's eyes were moving back and forth, and the other one did not have this, and that's where NREM and REM comes from. However, these two stages are very separate and have very separate functions and health benefits that we'll go on to talk about. There are 4 stages of NREM. Throughout your sleep, you will cycle from wakefulness to NREM to REM and back to wakefulness to NREM and REM again. And you go through 90-minute cycles between these 3 stages. Now, the proportion of NREM to REM changes throughout your sleep. At the beginning and throughout the middle of your sleep, you are in NREM sleep majority of the time. However, in the last portion of your sleep, it becomes heavily REM focused. Now this means that if you go to sleep later, you're going to lose a portion of your NREM sleep. And at the same time, if you wake up earlier, you're going to lose that REM sleep. Now these portions of sleep cannot be earned back. Now we have the ability to look at brain waves during these stages of sleep. Studies have shown that NREM consists of slow, deep brain waves that are synchronized. However, REM sleep has frenetic brain waves that are of fast frequency and match our brain waves when we are awake. The function of NREM is to remove old redundant information and to cement new memories and new information. Your hippocampus acts as a temporary storage for information throughout the day. However, it is small and cannot hold a large amount of information. So during NREM sleep, especially NREM stage 2, there is information that is moved from the hippocampus to your cortex throughout NREM stage sleep. NREM sleep has also been found to be crucial for skill memory. Pianists have gone to sleep struggling to play a song perfectly or even half as good as they would like. However, the next day they found that they're able to perform well and better than they could have expected. The reason why is that NREM stage 2 of sleep is able to strengthen these skill memories and make these motor skills more automatic the following day after a good night of NREM sleep. An experiment looking at subjects typing with the opposite hand has shown that those who slept in between tests had a 20% improvement in performance speed and 35% improvement in accuracy, which attributes to the NREM sleep that helps strengthen skill memory. REM sleep is the stage in which we dream. Now, REM sleep has 3 main important functions. Firstly, REM sleep allows us to reprocess upsetting memories. So during REM sleep, and this is the only time throughout your sleep and during the day where noradrenaline is not released and it's shut off completely. At the same time, during REM sleep, we have certain regions of the brains that are increased and hyperactivated. These include our amygdala, which is the emotional center, hippocampus, our memory center, the visual spatial regions for visual images, and the motor cortex, which represents movement. So all of these brain regions are activated to let us experience that memory again, however without the noradrenaline, so without that stress hormone. So we are able to experience the details of that memory and incorporate that into our understanding and our learning without having that emotional charge and that stressful emotion attached to that memory. Now, an example of where this function of REM sleep does not work is in PTSD patients. So PTSD patients keep reliving certain memories and traumatic experiences with that emotion and experience it the same level of that emotion that they initially experienced. They keep going through it again. Now, there have been many studies into this, and the main theory that has come back is that in PTSD patients, the level of noradrenaline is so high that it actually interferes with REM sleep. It's not shut off. And now the brain every night keeps trying to go over that memory to kind of reprocess that memory and take the emotional charge of it. But because of noradrenaline, the REM sleep in these PTSD patients is affected. And so these patients keep suffering from that nightmare, reliving that experience again and again with that same level of emotion. Doctors are now treating PTSD patients by prescribing prazosin, a drug that reduces blood pressure and reduces noradrenaline. This allows REM sleep to take place and for the patient to go through and process that difficult and traumatic experience. The second function of REM sleep is to allow us to identify the subtle emotional facial expressions that we identify throughout the day previously. It has allowed us to fine-tune the emotional circuits and improve our emotional intelligence. And this factor has been credited as a very important factor in our evolution. It has allowed us to have an understanding of social cultural complexity and help create collective alliances that are cooperative alliances between individuals of people and tribes. And that's an important factor that has led us today to form the societies that we do have. Lastly, REM sleep is essential for creativity and solving abstract problems. The scientist Dmitry Mendeleev, who created the periodic table that contained all the chemistry elements, he was struggling for many years on how to create a format and a table containing all of these elements. He was sleep deprived for 3 days. However, on his sleep rebound, he found that he dreamt of a periodic table in his mind, and he remarked on this later on. So it was the sleep that helped Dmitry Mendeleev write the periodic table that we all use today. The type of sleep stage that an individual is in when they awaken does not reverse instantaneously. For example, if an individual is in NREM sleep and they are awoken, that NREM will linger for a few minutes afterwards. So this premise was used to perform an experiment where individuals were assessed with a cognitive test when awoken at different stages of sleep, from wakefulness to NREM to REM. They found that those that were woken from REM sleep had the greatest ability to problem solve, and these solutions came to them instantaneously. This shows that REM sleep has the ability to think abstractly and solve different problems. We have identified that all animal species, even insects, sleep. We have observed this by detecting immobility and reduced responsiveness in all animal species and insects. Moreover, even bacteria have active and passive phases that correspond to light and dark cycles. However, different animal species sleep different lengths of time. Tigers and lions sleep up to 15 hours, brown bats 19 hours, and elephants only 4 hours. We have yet to identify a factor that contributes to the length of time slept. It does not relate to whether they are prey or predator, their size, their intelligence. So this is still a field that is being looked at. Interestingly enough, only birds and mammals have REM sleep. REM sleep is not seen in insects, amphibians, fish, or reptiles. Think about ocean aquatic life forms. If they had REM sleep, they would lose all muscle tone, and muscle tone is required to swim to the surface and breathe. Therefore, it is not an evolutionary advantage for them to have REM sleep. An example that is interesting is of fur seals. Fur seals will have REM sleep when they are on land. However, when they are in the ocean, they do not show any signs of REM sleep. In today's society, humans show a monophasic pattern of sleeping, a long bout of sleeping. However, previously, hunter-gatherer tribes used to have a biphasic pattern of sleeping. They would have also a 90-minute nap in the afternoon. Now this makes sense because after you eat, you often have feel this postprandial drowsiness, and this is thought to be the reason why they would have naps during the afternoon. So one could argue that we're kind of genetically driven to have these afternoon naps. Humans have a higher percentage of REM sleep compared to other primates like apes. Humans sleep about 20 to 25% of REM sleep. Apes, in comparison, and other primates sleep less, around 9%. Now, why is this? Well, it is thought that humans developed the ability to sleep on the ground by developing fire to ward off predators. Other primates, however, had to sleep in the trees, and so REM sleep, where you lose all muscle tone, would mean that they would fall to the ground. So we developed this advantage of sleeping on the ground and therefore having the ability to have REM sleep, which, as I mentioned earlier, allowed us to develop this understanding of emotional facial expressions that are identified throughout the previous day, and to allow cooperative and collective alliances to develop. The type of sleep that we have throughout our lifetime changes from a fetus to an infant to an adolescent, an adult, and then an elderly individual. And also the type and proportion of NREM to REM sleep changes throughout our lifetime. In the last trimester of pregnancy, the fetus develops REM sleep and wakefulness. The REM sleep has been attributed as being very important for creating new synapses, synaptogenesis, and creating neural pathways. Interestingly enough, autism has been identified as being as a result of abnormal synaptogenesis, so abnormal creation of synapses. In autistic individuals, there have been identifications of lower melatonin levels and a reduced ability to generate sleep. Alcohol consumption during pregnancy has been found to reduce REM sleep that a fetus is able to obtain. Infants and young children experience a polyphasic pattern of sleeping. They'll have naps throughout the day and throughout the evening, and continuously wake up throughout the day and evening. And this is because their suprachiasmatic nucleus is slowly developing over time. They are slowly establishing a 24-hour rhythm. Now, the proportion of NREM to REM increases as we age throughout that age range. And it eventually stabilizes at 80% NREM and 20% REM in the human being. As infants and young children age, their NREM increases, and this results in an increased synaptic pruning and reorganization that allows the increased critical thinking, reasoning, and cognitive intelligence that we see across the age groups. The adolescent experiences a similar circadian rhythm to adults. However, it is later than the adult circadian rhythm, and that is why adolescents often tend to sleep later and wake up later. Their circadian rhythm is in fact later, and then stabilizes back to earlier, an adult version, in a few years later when they reach adult stage. It is theorized that these later sleeping hours help to encourage independence of adolescence, and therefore providing a social evolutionary advantage. As we age from young adults to elderly adults, our ability to generate sleep is reduced, and this can happen from as early as our late 20s and early 30s. Our ability to create deep NREM sleep reduces dramatically. By the time we're in our 40s, our NREM sleep can be reduced from 60 to 70%. When we are in our 70s, our NREM sleep can be reduced as much as 80 to 90%. As we age, we have increased fragmented sleep. We increasingly wake up throughout the night. It is argued that this fragmented sleep reduces the length of our sleeping, and alongside the reduced NREM sleep means we have reduced quantity and quality of sleep. This has been argued to be related to the increased mortality risk and reduced physical health and reduced cognitive health as we age, as well as the increased rates of depression in elderly age. In our elderly ages, we also experience earlier bedtimes and regression in sleep timings. This is due to an earlier rise in melatonin levels as we age in, especially in the elderly. And this means that the social life of the elderly can be severely affected. They either stay at the event in the evenings and experience poor sleep by missing out those crucial NREM hours that they have, or they miss the event completely and manage to get their full sleep. Why is it that the elderly experience this reduced NREM deep sleep? This is because as we age, especially in the elderly, there is atrophy of the middle frontal regions of our brain. And these regions is where the sleep generating regions of our brain occur. Reduced deep NREM sleep means we have a reduced ability to cement new memories and retain new facts. And this is why it is seen sometimes in elderly to have reduced cognitive ability to remember new facts that they experienced in previous days. What are the dangers of inadequate sleep? So if we have inadequate sleep, this can lead to something called microsleep, where we have momentary lapses of concentration. Even 2 seconds of microsleep whilst driving can lead to death. An experiment was conducted where subjects would press a button every time they saw a light. Now, sleep-deprived subjects were shown to have slower responses and sometimes completely missed responses. Now, imagine you have this sleep deprivation when you're driving. This can lead to reduced, slower responses and maneuvers and completely missed responses to any dangerous other cars. The study showed that those who slept 4 hours for 6 nights had the same performance level as someone who had not slept for 24 hours straight. Similarly, someone who had slept 6 hours for 10 days straight had the same performance as someone who had not slept at all for 24 hours straight. What is even more worrying is that those who were sleep deprived consistently underestimated how poor their performance was. Subjects that were awake for 19 hours were as cognitively impaired as those that were legally drunk. The study showed that there is a nosedive in performance after 15 hours. At 16 hours, the brain starts to fail. Evidence shows that there are more vehicle accidents in the US from drowsy driving compared to alcohol and drug combined. Now, the reason for this is because of late braking, late evasive maneuvers, and the absence of responses during microsleep. The advice is that if you are drowsy whilst driving, pull up on the side and have a nap. And then 20 to 30 minutes after you wake up, do not drive because of sleep inertia. It will take a while for you to come back to the same level of alertness. However, it is important to note that power naps do not compensate for missed sleep. Now, there are many successful individuals that say they only need 6 hours of sleep. We have identified that there is a variant gene known as the DEC2 gene that allows the sleepless elite, 1% of the population, to have minimal impairment on 6 hours of sleep. However, it is important to note that only 1% have this gene, and the majority of us, other than these sleepless elite, require the full 8 hours of sleep. Sleep deprivation also affects our emotional stability. This is because of 2 reasons. Firstly, there is increased activity in the amygdala in those that are sleep deprived. The amygdala is the emotional region of our brain, the region that generates anger, rage, sadness. And the other second factor is that there is reduced inhibition from the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex acts as the brake, the rational thought and logical thinking onto and inhibits the amygdala. And because of the reduced inhibition from the prefrontal cortex and the increased activity of the amygdala in sleep-deprived individuals, you have this increased emotional instability and inappropriate emotional reactions in those that are sleep-deprived. The other region of the brain that is affected in sleep-deprived individuals is the striatum. The striatum is involved in impulsivity and reward emotion. Now, this happens because of increased activity in the striatum and again reduced control from the prefrontal cortex on the striatum. Now remember, the prefrontal cortex acts as the CEO of the brain. It is involved in providing inhibition in regions of the brain. So you have reduced inhibition in the amygdala from the prefrontal cortex and in the striatum. So this results in increased negative emotions from the amygdala and increased positive emotions from rewards in the striatum. And you swing between these very high positive moods and very high negative moods. And this can lead to this kind of mania that is seen in sleep-deprived individuals. Risk-taking and addiction behaviors are also increased in sleep-deprived individuals because of this increased activity in the striatum and reduced inhibition from the prefrontal cortex on the striatum. Studies have shown that an absence of just one night of sleep can re-trigger mania and depression in those with these conditions. Now let us consider the physical effects and consequences of sleep deprivation. A condition that has been linked to sleep deprivation is Alzheimer's. 60% of Alzheimer patients have at least one clinical sleeping disorder. It has been discovered that Alzheimer's is caused by the buildup of amyloid plaques in the brain. Significant amyloid plaques have been identified in the middle frontal lobe, where this is with the region for generating sleep. During deep NREM sleep, a cerebrospinal fluid covers the brain, and this cerebrospinal fluid helps to remove toxic metabolites released from these neurons. And these toxic metabolites include amyloid beta and tau protein. Both of these proteins are involved in poisoning the neurons and damaging and leading to Alzheimer's. The cerebrospinal fluid helps to remove these toxic metabolites by inserting them into the glia lymphatic system. However, in the elderly, this deep NREM sleep is reduced, and therefore the ability of the cerebrospinal fluid to remove these toxic metabolites, such as amyloid, is reduced, and this buildup of amyloid results in Alzheimer's. This is the current theory of how sleep deprivation affects and leads to Alzheimer's. Sleep deprivation also affects the cardiovascular system. Studies have shown that those who sleep less than 6 hours per night have a 200% increased risk of developing and dying from a stroke or a heart attack. This is because sleep deprivation leads to an increased activity in the sympathetic nervous system, the system responsible for our fight or flight response. This increased activity of the sympathetic nervous system leads to increased blood pressure, increased heart rate, increased levels of cortisol released, which also leads to increased blood pressure, and also reduced growth hormone level. Growth hormone is used to repair the endothelium of blood vessels. Therefore, a reduced level of growth hormone leads to an increased risk of fractured vasculature, therefore leading to increased vulnerability of atherosclerosis, which ultimately leads to increased blood pressure. It is widely thought that NREM sleep reduces the activity of the sympathetic nervous system. Sleep deprivation has also been linked to abnormal blood sugar levels and type 2 diabetes. Those that sleep less have cells that are less receptive to insulin, and therefore these cells take up less glucose than one would expect, and therefore it leads to type 2 diabetes. Diabetes has been shown to reduce life expectancy by up to 10 years. Sleep deprivation has also been linked to increased weight gain. Sleep-deprived individuals have increased levels of ghrelin and reduced levels of leptin. Ghrelin is a hormone that stimulates hunger. Leptin is a hormone that stimulates satiety, a feeling of being full. Now, in sleep-deprived individuals, you have increased ghrelin and reduced leptin, so you have an increased level of appetite. And another thing that's been identified in studies is that sleep-deprived individuals will crave more sugary foods, increased carbohydrates and salty snacks more than the healthy foods. Craving of unhealthy foods in sleep-deprived individuals has been attributed to the fact that there is reduced control from the prefrontal cortex on the brain and especially on the striatum. Sleep deprivation has been identified infecting the reproductive system in both males and females. Sleep-deprived males can experience low testosterone levels, which leads to fatigue and reduced concentration and reduced libido. And they also experience reduced sperm counts of up to 29% lower and increased sperm deformities. In females, they experience lower FSH levels reduced by 20%, as well as abnormal menstrual cycles and subfertility. Sleep deprivation can also affect the immune system. It can lead to reduced immune responses and therefore an increased infection rate of pneumonia, influenza, and other infections. A single night of 4 hours of sleep has been shown to reduce the number of natural killer cells by 70%. Natural killer cells have an essential role in removing malignant cells. This leads to a significant state of immune deficiency. Sleep deprivation has also shown to lead to a reduced antibody response to vaccinations. This has been seen in Hep A and Hep B vaccines. And it is shown that even if you have plentiful of sleep after the vaccination, you'll never achieve full antibody response if the sleep-deprived individual got the vaccination. A large European study of 25,000 individuals showed that those that slept less than 6 hours per night had a 40% increased risk of developing cancer. Denmark has recognized this risk by paying compensation to women that develop breast cancer after working these night jobs in government jobs such as nursing. Other factors that lead to increased risk of cancer in sleep-deprived individuals is a increased overactive sympathetic nervous system. This leads to increased sustained inflammation and also increased inflammatory markers. Inflammatory markers help blood vessels grow around the tumour, therefore providing more nutrients and oxygen to these tumours. Sleep has also been found to affect our DNA and genes. Sleep deprivation leads to some genes being increasingly expressed and some gene expression to be reduced. Scientists have discovered that the genes that are increasingly expressed are genes that relate to chronic inflammation, cardiovascular disease, and cellular stress. The genes that are reduced in expression are those that stabilize metabolism and genes that stabilize cholesterol levels. Our DNA is kept compact in chromosomes. Sleep deprivation leads to the ends of the chromosomes, the telomeres, being damaged. Now let's look at some sleep disorders. What is the difference between sleep deprivation and insomnia? Sleep deprivation is when one has adequate ability to generate sleep, but does not give oneself adequate opportunity to sleep. Insomnia is, however, quite different. Insomnia is when an individual has inadequate ability to generate sleep, despite giving themselves adequate opportunity to get to sleep. There are considered two types of insomnia: onset insomnia, where the individual finds it difficult to fall asleep, and maintenance insomnia, where the individual finds it difficult to stay asleep. You can have both types of insomnia. Insomnia is diagnosed when an individual has reduced quality or quantity of sleep with significant distress or day impairment for at least 3 nights a week for more than 3 months. If you are suffering from insomnia, it is recommended that you are referred to see a sleep medicine doctor. It is believed that 1/9 of Americans suffer from insomnia. Insomnia can be caused by a range of factors. Up to 28 to 45% of insomnia cases can have a strong genetic heritability aspect to them. However, other external causes can be contributing, such as too much bright light before you sleep, caffeine, alcohol consumption, and the wrong core body temperature before you sleep. However, the most important triggers for insomnia are actually found to be emotional distress and anxiety. This is because emotional distress and anxiety before you sleep leads to an overactive sympathetic nervous system. This leads to an increased metabolic rate and therefore an increased core body temperature, which can prevent you from having your body temperature drop 2 to 3 degrees Celsius, which is needed for good sleep. Emotional anxiety and distress also leads to increased cortisol levels and adrenaline levels, which can prevent you from falling into deep NREM sleep. Another sleeping disorder is narcolepsy. This is when an individual experiences excessive daytime sleepiness, sleep paralysis, and cataplexy. Cataplexy describes a loss of muscle tone. Now, cataplexy can be triggered by strong emotions. So this can be like laughter, surprise, both positive and negative emotions. As you can imagine, this can be very difficult for such an individual. Narcolepsy is thought to arise as a mutation but not an inherited disorder. Narcolepsy is thought to arise following a reduced amount of orexin that I mentioned earlier at the beginning of this video. Orexin is a hormone released from the hypothalamus and that travels to the brainstem. The function of orexin is to open the sensory thalamus gate that increases our awareness and perception of the outside world and therefore stimulates wakefulness. Patients that have narcolepsy have a reduction by about 90% in the cells that produce orexin. They also have reduced orexin receptors in the brainstem. This leads them to be in a state between sleepfulness and wakefulness all the time. There is also a condition known as fatal familial insomnia, and a key example of this condition is shown in Michael Cork, a 40-year-old gentleman who experienced 8 hours straight of no sleep. He was not able to sleep even a wink of sleep, and this led to a rapid cognitive decline to the point that he was not able to coordinate walking. By 6 months, he was bedridden, and the clinical picture showed a patient of dementia signs. He also experienced hallucinations, and he was unable to generate language. Fatal familial insomnia occurs as a result of a genetic mutation that leads to prion proteins attacking the thalamus sensory gate, leaving the thalamus sensory gate in an open permanent position, meaning that the individual cannot experience sleep as they are always perceptive of the outside world. Experiments on rats have shown that rats will die after 15 days of no sleep. In these experiments, rats lose body mass, they lose the ability to regulate the core body temperature, their immune system shuts down, and in the end they die from their own gut bacteria getting into their bloodstream and causing septicemia. In the last part of this video, I'm going to talk about ways you can increase the quality of your sleep. One of the factors that can affect your quality of sleep is artificial light in the evenings. Artificial light in the evening can trick your suprachiasmatic nucleus into thinking the sun has not set. Therefore, your melatonin is not released as early enough as it should be. Even a hint of dim light of 8 to 10 lux can delay melatonin release. Most feeble bedside lamps release about 20 to 80 lux. The worst type of light to be exposed to in the evenings is blue LED light. Blue LED light is released from smartphones and iPads and other electronic devices. This is because our eyes contain light receptors that are most sensitive to the short wavelengths released from the blue LED lights. Experiments have shown that iPad reading 2 hours prior to sleep can reduce melatonin levels by over 50%. This means that your melatonin levels are delayed by about 3 hours. Another important factor to help you fall asleep is to lower your core body temperature. Your core body temperature needs to fall by about 2 to 3 degrees Celsius. The perfect core body temperature to fall asleep has been discovered to be 18.3 degrees Celsius. There are temperature sensing receptors in your hypothalamus that send signals to the suprachiasmatic nucleus to release melatonin levels. A technique to drop your core body temperature, if you are struggling with this, is to have a warm bath. This will bring the blood vessels in your hands, feet and face to the surface of the skin, and then when you get out of the bath, the heat will radiate out of these blood vessels, lowering your core body temperature. It is important to avoid drinking coffee. Coffee competes with a chemical known as adenosine that I mentioned earlier in this video. Adenosine acts as a pressure to help you fall asleep. So if you're competing with adenosine for the adenosine receptors, you are reducing the ability of adenosine to generate sleep. Avoid drinking alcohol, as alcohol leads to fragmented sleep and is a suppressor of REM sleep. The metabolite of alcohol, known as aldehyde, suppresses REM sleep. Other tips mentioned in this book include don't take a nap after 3 p.m, don't have heavy meals before you sleep. Included at the end of this video a list of tips to improve the quality of your sleep. Another important point to mention that the author does mention is that you should try and maintain a routine of sleeping pattern. you should try to go to sleep at the same time and wake up at the same time every day. And the author recommends that you in fact use an alarm clock to go to sleep. Don't use an alarm clock to wake up as so much, because the author argues that this damages your cardiovascular system, as it overactivates your sympathetic nervous system in the morning when the alarm clock goes. The book also talks about sleeping pills. Sleeping pills do not stimulate natural sleep. They do not stimulate deep brain waves. Sleeping pills lead to next day grogginess, daytime forgetfulness, and slower reaction times. Sleeping pills have also been shown to lead to drug tolerance, and therefore when you take away the drug, you experience drug withdrawal effects, and you can experience insomnia when you stop taking the drug. Experiments have shown that there is no statistical difference between those taking sleeping pills and those taking placebo in falling asleep. Moreover, the sleeping pill Ambien has been found to act as a memory eraser. Experiments have shown that the Ambien sleeping pill causes 50% of your cell connections that you make during learning to be weakened. A study has found that sleeping pill users are 4.6 times more likely to die in a 2.5-year window period compared to non-sleeping pill users. These individuals were matched for age, gender, BMI, exercise, smoking, alcohol, drinking, and a lot of things. So there is significant research behind it. I hope you've enjoyed today's video, and I strongly advocate you reading this book and looking at the research for yourself. I hope you've learned that sleep has numerous benefits, from helping you be creative to solving abstract problems, cementing memories and new facts, and that the consequences of sleep can affect many different areas of your body and affect your health in the long term. All the best.